Reza is a very special, well, I've already introduced Daniel Pinchbeck to you yesterday, but Reza is a very special friend of mine. I only have one like this. Like really only one. Each time I talk to him, each time he reminds me how much the planet is dying.
That's a terrible
It's Reza, I will forgive myself for this terrible introduction. And makes me aware, how much I'll finish it still, because I love you.
I feel it.
You feel it?
Is this on? Yes.
Reza Bundy.
Thank you, Loic.
And Daniel Pinchbeck. I will leave them here because he doesn't like what I'm saying.
I love Loic, and I'm not a doomsdayer, but I'm here to share with you some of the findings we've made collectively and also individually in the world that we operate in. So, thank you.
Thank you for reminding us.
My pleasure.
All right,
No,
Reza Bundy and Daniel.
Thank you for that last talk. I was really moved. I was really happy to hear that. It was a very beautiful tonality. And I think it's a great segue, in a way, into maybe more of the, kind of masculine sort of rational assessment of what's happening, on the planet and what we can expect, in the next decades. And I know that Reza has been working closely with think tanks, with the RAND Corporation, and has been really, looking deeply into, where we're heading. And it is bracing. When he brought me through it yesterday, I was definitely a little bit, in shock. Even though I've studied this stuff in great depth, it's, we forget, the profundity of it. So maybe you want to sort of run through some of your...
Sure. Really nice to meet you all. Merci, Loic, Magdalena, and everyone. I thought maybe I can just bring your attention to a map that a lot of governments are using now to project what 20, 30, 40 years might look like in the world. Now, behind me, you'll notice that there are areas in green and there's areas in brown, and both have gradients to it. So the green areas in the world are areas that will benefit from migration and climate change, areas where likely people will move to for food and water security. The areas in brown and dark brown represent areas that are uninhabitable or cannot produce food and water resources for 60 to 80% of the population. Now, this map was conducted by the World Bank, by the Pentagon, by various think tanks, and initially, they thought that this would be 2100, so roughly speaking, about 80 years from now. But as temperature patterns change and governments and people start collectively changing their patterns on regression of carbon rather than what they're doing now, which is using any carbon they can because of energy shortages, of wars, of embargoes, of sanctions, this might likely happen in 20, 30, or 40 years. So if you're living in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, generally the Southern Hemisphere, you're going to have to start looking at moving. If you're living in the Northern Hemisphere, you might want to edge northwards because ultimately the Arctic Circle is where most of food production will occur in the next 20, 30, and 40 years.
Reza, just to interrupt you for 1 second. We know that, we've had these projections of 1.5 degrees and we've missed these different cutoff points. Is this in any way interruptible? I mean, because this is obviously, you're looking at, most of the world and most of the global South basically out of the picture, which is, catastrophic on so many levels to contemplate. If there was to be this type of, global movement that, we wanted to see, and, Extinction Rebellion has tried to foment, where we were really doing everything we could, with regenerative technologies, reforestation, could this be in any way interrupted, or is this totally baked in at this point?
Listen, humans are very resilient, we're very innovative, and what we do is we adapt. We adapt to personal situations, to national situations. There will be technologies that will apply themselves to the environment that will regress this or even pause it for a while. But there's a gap between those technologies coming online and us being able to adapt. So fundamentally, there is that 20, 30-year gap where by the time we get to a technology that's applicable to till the soil, which not only just uses new technology, but permaculture and ancient technologies into one, these environments will come back to life. And the Earth has had 4.5 billion years of ebbs and flows of, droughts and wildfires and whatnot that effectively regenerate a lot of the soil and a lot of the waterways and a lot of the communities that we have thrived on for the last 2,000 years. So let me kind of share with you individual examples of how governments look at migration patterns. This is a pattern that governments are now talking about managed retreats, a retreat away from risk that's managed. So sea level rises in the next 20 and 30 years will affect coastlines, no question about it. Whether it's a big iceberg in Antarctica or various weather patterns that change the molecules in the water and expand them and rise them, these areas will be affected greatly. Hurricane impact zones in the southeast United States will obviously affect real estate, communities, infrastructure, farmlands.
Just interrupt for 1 second. You've decided for this talk just to focus on the U.S.
Well,
not showing
I
us.
want to show you guys, thank you for that, that there are two areas in the world that we focus on, the United States, North America. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, if you look at the map, you'll notice that North America will benefit. So this is an example of how the US government and Canada are looking at long-term adaptation and migration patterns. And so if you're living in the Southeast, or you're living in the West where there's a drought from Colorado to California, which has happened before, by the way, 1,200 years ago, there was a mega drought, and this pattern will likely last another 20 years, these areas increasingly become wildfire zones. And with the flooding in the Mississippi, these areas of risk are where Americans, for example, are looking to move away from in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Now, insurance companies see this and say, why should I insure a house in Northeast United States? Why should I insure a house in Florida? Well, they won't. And if you can't get insurance, you can't get mortgages or financing. So homes are increasingly impossible to sell because somebody needs a mortgage.
I guess if you go back to how these lands used to be lived on, people would have, nomadic communities. Like the indigenous people
Sure.
knew you weren't supposed to build, permanent settlements in some of these areas.
Well, I'll leave that to a much more educated class of people to talk about. But yeah, if you want to live in areas that are at risk, you have to adapt greatly. You have to be stewards of the land. You have to understand how to manage it and how to live within it. But right now, society is not built as such. Leadership in the world is not clued into these methods. And they look at now how to get away from these risks. So in America, for example, these are the areas where people will move to. And likely further north and into Canada as temperature increases.
I do want to have a little bit of like in the dark cloud, a silver droplet. I remember when I was studying, researching How Soon Is Now, there was, the assessment was that, the whole human population could feasibly settle in an area the size of Texas, and everybody would still have enough room for like a little like backyard barbecue or something like that. So, so there is that possibility that, even though this would be so, it's catastrophic to contemplate, if humanity was to, let's say, break out of its current like structures of, behavior and so on, we could actually, not see this sort of catastrophic loss of life. I mean, I know you had a projection of what we might see in the next 10 to 20 years, which...
It's not mine, it's other people's, but it's not about space. It's not about living in a 4-acre lot in Texas with 7.8 billion people.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, this is an important tenet. These lands include ecosystems that allow us to breathe, that allow water to be filtrated, to grow food on, to enable microcosms to feed other larger animals that ultimately become stewards of the land, like elephants. So land is actually as important as anything for our survivability in that it produces the necessary resources for us to collectively live and build an atmosphere around. And when you lose some of that land, and I'll give you an example, when you lose tropical rainforests, the animals move into human areas. And occasionally, the humans eat those animals. And when they do, there are pathogens that get exchanged between animals and humans, pathogens that normally live in closed ecosystems. Ebola, HIV/AIDS, COVID, these are diseases that have come about from animals and zoonotic diseases emerging into human life and filtrating into our bodies. And there's even more pathogens and various viruses that come out of ice that melt. But so it's key to understand that as much as we want to live in comfortable, safe environments, we have to go further afield to protect ecosystems so they don't affect us collectively or individually through some of the risks we discussed.
I'm curious, we were talking as we came over and about kind of this intentional community movement. And we kind of had a question for the audience, which might be interesting to see in, the raised hands. How many people here are in some way or other actively involved in creating an intentional community or kind of thinking about, if things get heavy, where they're going to move to, just out of curiosity. He said 80%. I'd say it's more like 40%.
I think a lot of you are doing it soon or have discussions around it or being asked to participate in one. Leadership is obviously important, but so is funding, so is accepting of the idea, and so is helping other people reach their goals of creating this community. So I think it's just a much broader number, and half of you have raised your hands, but the other half might end up living in these communities. So I think it's a collective movement, ultimately.
Do you want to go through the rest of your
No, it's not important, but yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious, Reza, so you've been, marinating in this data and this traumatic, in a way, information. What has it led you to kind of want to undertake? And, it's kind of like, how do we, find our individual and collective purpose in the face of these types of, magnitudinal shifts that are happening so rapidly?
Yeah, and just to give you a little background on myself, I've lived and worked in Africa, Middle East, Caribbean for 12 or 15 years now. And my specialty, or what I was drawn to, are failed states. So I've lived in Somalia, I've lived in Cuba, Haiti, Yemen, Nigeria, Iran. And what I have seen on the front lines of these situations is that there is earthquakes, there are droughts, there are resource-stricken tribes that fall upon each other to feed their animals and their humans. And the more, if you will, issues there are around climate, the more people act in ways that are vibrationally destructive. And that has a plateau because at one point you just hit a wall. And society either collapses on itself or fundamentally it loses its collective resiliency. And that's when awakening has happened. And I'm not suggesting we do that as a way to get to the other side, but if we have no choice in our efforts and cannot effectively push back these...
When you say awakening, I'm a little bit concerned. I'm trying to understand what exactly...
Well, I mean, this is a, PAUA, but so awakening in the sense is we have to recognize that we need each other to get through these events. And too much of the time we look at natural resources, money, shelter, food, whatnot, as individual needs. And if you look at it collectively, you actually can feed your neighbors so that they don't break into your house. And you understand that your community is your resiliency.
Okay, so you're saying that as a result of this magnitude of these changes, we're going to become more sort of community interdependent by necessity.
That's right, and we'll be driven to each other, and there'll be a self-selection process. So those of you who are building communities are at the forefront of this. But on the tail end of it, people will recognize that those communities you're building will be the areas that they will likely find the most safety in. Because governments won't be able to produce this because they're too busy operating in the traditional way of things.
So, I mean, what we're seeing right now in this sort of period, I mean, even in relatively affluent societies like, the US and parts of Europe, there seems to be this movement towards authoritarianism, sort of what seems like a regressive movement, which I think is reflecting the fear and the insecurity that people are feeling about the future. And so they look to like a strong leader or something very simple to kind of create coherence, But that seems to me that, that is not going to be a long-term solution because dictatorships are very unwieldy. Ultimately, the dictator becomes a psycho, and then the whole thing, pivots out of control, as we're also seeing. So, I mean, what would be your trajectory in terms of how you think, the sort of political systems, economic systems, what kind of evolution might take place to sort of mitigate, or deal with some of what's emerging?
Well, do you buy into the political system? That's a question. Are you part of that political system? Are you opting out of it? Because, you know, political systems requires participation. If you don't participate, not just voting, for example, but just don't really pay attention to what is being asked of you to do if it's fundamentally doesn't feel right, that is exit into a community that is more conscious is effectively how these systems will lose power. And that involves potentially communities that are far afield from areas of power and influence by governments. And as people migrate out of those areas, they'll build systems and communities that are self-serving. And technology is a big cornerstone. We talk about this. Daniel's written many books on this subject and how technology and community and ancient technologies together can create governance, and governance that is outside of the scope of a hierarchical, you know, system that authoritarianism then results in. And so that's the kind of flow, I think, that we're all collectively trying to move towards.
We were also talking about how there are technologies on the horizon, but they're just not quite there yet, that could have a tremendous impact in a positive sense. So we were talking about nuclear fusion as one. What were some, you know, what are your thoughts about that? And
Well,
some
I
of the
mean,
other
you know,
options?
nuclear fusion is incredible. A reactor as big as this hallway will produce enough energy from water that is contained in that reactor and evaporates and recollects to house energy to be able to produce 200,000 homes full of regenerative energy, light, heat, you know, you name it. And those IoT robotic systems that are coming online will be able to generate necessary tillage of the soil in the form of tractors and whatnot that can do it at scale without the necessary skills that require years and generations of thought leadership.
I thought tillage was part of the problem, right? Don't we need sort of to go back to no-till agriculture? Because the tillage releases CO2.
It does. It depends how you use it. But tillage could be from a plow from a cow. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big combine harvester. But there are technologies that will ultimately satisfy what we are looking to build and what we're looking to build into. Now the collective needs to employ themselves into those technologies to understand how to work those technologies and understand how and appreciate how they could be part of the collective good. And the answer to what I think is going to be a transformational change in how we live our lives. And what's going to, the impetus to this is climate change and various other conflicts that arise from competing on resources that are now becoming more and more limited.
And what's your, so, you know, I mean, we only have a minute and 20 seconds left, apparently.
Oh, I know.
What's the core of your, because you're saying you're not a doomsayer. I mean, this is a little doomy. Where is your optimism? Like, what, you know, where do you draw your optimism? What do you see as a positive
Listen,
potential in this
I
situation?
mean, come on, we're in France right now, right? World War I, World War II, Prussian, you know, Franco-Prussian War. There have been, in history, massive events. Just because we've avoided them for the last 2 generations doesn't mean they won't happen again. And so within these conflicts come ultimately leadership,
Okay, cool.
heroism,
Okay, cool.
and the ability to really propagate safety. So, you know, yeah, sure, people, it's not going to be comfortable. But I don't want to use that as a way to push you into something you don't want to do. You will find, through your own instincts, the stories that you need to tell yourself as you look at the world and the events unfolding that precipitate you to act in a way that is not just protecting yourself, but knowing that in protecting others, you're also protecting yourself. And that is the collective mindset that I think will help us get through to the other side. And so for that, I'm optimistic.
By the way, we were given an extra 5 minutes by the ancient gods of PAUA. They came in and said,
Does anyone want 5 minutes? I mean, I don't want to bore.
yeah, but I have so many questions, and yeah, we could take a couple, you know, long time on this. But I mean, we were talking also about, you know, there's some regions of the world that have amassed tremendous financial resources, like the Gulf states, and yet they're looking at kind of obliteration, you know, in a way ecologically.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen?
About the Gulf states for a second. I mean, I am from Iran, which is on the right side of things here. And, you know, when you look at the Gulf, as opposed to Canada, which is the ideal scenario, or the ideal place to live, this is possibly the worst area that will be affected by climate change. Now, in the areas in dark red, there's something that will produce itself called wet bulb, which is when precipitation and heat meet in a construct that effectively creates bigger water molecules in the air, and you can't breathe for a long time outside. So summers will go from 3 to 6 months, and temperatures at 36 Celsius, 96 Fahrenheit will create in certain parts of the world that are traditionally humid, a humidity level that outside of 15 minutes you can't breathe being outside for 6 months of the year. So what do you do? Do you live in malls? Do you go underground? Do you create new cities that are air conditioned? Do you use fusion to be able to create atmospheric, bubbles? I don't know, but I know this. These folks who happen to be supplying the majority of the carbon in the world will likely have to migrate because Qatar, UAE, Jeddah, all these people that are living on the coastlines will have to go inland. And if you look at the patterns in yellow, this is a plateau, it's dry, it's not humid. So most people will likely move into the north west of the peninsula. In a little town called Neom, which is where the Saudi Arabian government is now building this magnificent city-state, which is questionable whether they can execute on, but it is the right design for where we need to go ultimately. So even within the context of this geography, people are thinking, because they're at the cusp of the edge of climate change being affecting them, they are thinking about this, and that technology and that process will likely affect how we live, and we should understand what they're doing there. We should explore, we should educate ourselves, and draw from them designs and ideas that they've plundered billions of dollars into developing that we can apply. So this is a collective answer. Even in Saudi Arabia, we might learn something in this case.
I noticed from your initial map of what areas are going to be kind of groovy and good and which are going to not be so good. Russia was looking awesome.
Russia's great.
Siberia was looking amazing. We seem to have some issues with Russia and Siberia right now. I mean, do you feel that this the current conflict with Russia is related to these kind of deeper geopolitical concerns, or the sort of geological, ecological?
Listen, I think we all have come to the conclusion that if you operate the way you have in the last 2 millennia in wielding power, destroying other countries, and generally being a bad actor in the global, ecosystem, you're not going to survive. You're not going to survive. And if you don't survive, what comes after you? And that's where opportunities arise. We can't stop conflict. We can adapt, and we can build beyond conflict to see now what those designs are that, when implemented after authoritarian regimes are self-selected out, we can actually implement scale and change. So I'm more interested in that foresight. And as entrepreneurs, we all are, I believe, certainly Loic and Danielle and others are in this room, this is the work that needs to be done.
I guess maybe one last question, or did I lose my question? Oh, I was going to ask you about blockchain. Do you see a positive role for blockchain technologies in terms of creating like new financial and political structures, and what could that look like that could help us get through this cul-de-sac?
Blockchain is basically a distribution of information and value, whether it's money, whether it's ideas, whether it's collective voting, whatever it is, it's just a technology. I don't think it's the solution to everything.
How could it be utilized in terms of, for instance, like we were talking about the financial system, the debt-based dollar system?
You can base a currency on land that is benefits from climate change and migration patterns. You can base it on commodities that are important to rewire a country, to build batteries and whatnot. You can even base it on old currencies that are dying, but are negatively correlated to real assets that go up in value as the dollar goes down or euro goes down. So there's a tremendous amount of dynamicism that could be harbored in blockchain that could produce results that are not just monetary stability, but also collective voting and governance, and how you allocate resources to areas that are not with power, but require investments to make those areas formidable for long-term adaptation. And so that consensus layer, that egalitarianism that comes from blockchain, which doesn't exist in the blockchain industry currently, it's very skewed towards what they call whales, should be released into the population, and I think that's going to happen.
Thank you very much, Reza. That was intense.
I love you. Thank you.
I love you, Reza. I love you.
I love you.